The first sound was a tap light, deliberate, not the wind or a loose shutter. I'd been drinking coffee on the porch, watching dust drift low across the bare rows where sorghum had failed when it came again. The mug went still in my hand. Habit made me ease the revolver free before I crossed the boards. Third tap. I swung the door open and found her there, not a stranger grown, but a bundled child, no bigger than a loaf of bread, eyes wide and fixed on nothing, her skin cool against the morning air. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Burke Calter. I've worked this patch of land alone for near a decade, a dozen miles past Willow Creek, and farther still from the kind of talk a man can't stomach. I was raised in the hill country by folks who believed in keeping your word and minding your neighbor's fence line as you would your own. We didn't waste, we didn't brag, and Sunday meant the whole family sat straight back through the hymns before walking home to a table that always had enough, even in lean years. The war took me east when I was still green, and a piece of shrapnel followed me home in my thigh. No surgeon could dig it out without taking the leg, so I learned to live with the pain. After that, I married young, built the cabin with my own hands, and thought the worst was behind me. But 6 winters back, a fever swept through faster than we could heat water or pray. It took my wife and the child she carried before the midwife could even give me a name to call them by. Since then, I've kept a routine. Fix the fences, check the goats, ride the ridge for strays. The nearest town runs on new money from the rail spur, the kind that pays for polished boots and saloon lamps, but looks down on a man who still mends his coat 3 times before buying another. I keep my distance. Town talk always circles back to the war or my loss, and neither's a subject I share for strangers' sympathy. That morning, the air was cool enough to bite the fingertips, the kind that carries sound clear across the flats. I'd just set the mug down when the tapping began, and by the time I opened the door, the sun was only a hand's width above the horizon. The baby was wrapped in buckskin beadwork along one edge torn in haste. No note, no basket, just a stillness in her that set my jaw tight. Somewhere beyond the fence, whoever had left her was already gone. I bent and gathered her up light as kindling the warmth of her pressing through my shirt. Behind me, the stove gave off a steady crackle. In front of me lay a choice that wouldn't wait for second thoughts. I stepped back inside and closed the door against the wind. I carried the baby inside, closing the door against the wind and setting her down in a wooden box I'd lined with an old wool blanket. The stove had the room warm, but she was still too cold to be left alone. I searched the shelves for something she could take. There was no cow here and no nursing goat with fresh milk. All I found was a half-empty bottle of molasses. I warmed water mixed in a thin ribbon of syrup and tested the heat on my wrist. With a clean scrap of cotton, I let drops fall into her mouth until she swallowed. Her eyelids eased halfway shut, and within minutes, she was asleep. The days that followed slid into a strange rhythm. I fed her 4 times a day, kept her close at night because the cabin had a draft, and learned how light a sling made the work. An old flour sack tied over my shoulder let me carry her while I mended the fence or checked the goats. Talking to her felt awkward at first, but silence felt worse, so I told her about every nail I hammered and every board I fit. She watched with dark eyes, following my mouth, as if the shape of words mattered. Each evening I lit the lantern and set it on the porch rail. I couldn't say why, except it felt like someone might be looking. On the 5th night, a hard rain came sudden, striking the shutters and rattling the roof. I'd just settled her in the blanket-lined box when I saw a shape cross the yard. Small, swaying hair plastered to her face. She didn't knock. I opened the door before she could. A young Apache woman stood there barefoot, clothing soaked, skin burning with fever under streaks of mud. Her arms hung at her sides, fingers shaking from cold and exhaustion. She didn't look at me, only at the box near the stove where the baby stirred. She stepped inside, knees nearly giving out. At the box, she knelt, resting her palms on the rough boards. The baby woke with a thin cry, and the woman's shoulders pulled tight with relief, so strong it almost folded her. She gathered the child, pressed her forehead against that tiny chest, and whispered words I didn't understand. I set the bar across the door, not to keep her in, but to keep the storm out. A blanket went around her shoulders. She flinched, then looked up at me with cautious eyes, but didn't move away. "You've got a fever," I told her, keeping my voice low. "Sit by the fire." She did more because she had no strength left than from trust. I poured hot water over dried willow bark and held the tin while she drank. The baby settled, content with the scent and warmth of her mother. There were burns on her wrists, fresh scars across one shoulder. I didn't ask. Questions could wait. "She's been eating," I said after a while. "Not much more than molasses water, but it kept her alive." Her eyes filled not with tears, but with a weight I'd seen in men who'd been spared worse than they feared. She spoke a single word, her name. "Nidita." I gave mine in return. I rolled out a pallet near the stove and set a kettle to steam more willow bark. She lay with the baby tucked under her buckskin shawl. I sat in the chair with the Henry rifle across my lap, more out of habit than suspicion, listening to the storm shift east. Through the night, I wiped sweat from her brow, the memory of doing the same for my wife, pushing close but never spoken aloud. When dawn came, pale through the chinks in the wall, both mother and child slept in the same slow rhythm. I didn't know what the law would call what I'd done, harboring, aiding, but the choice sat firm. They'd stay until they could go on their own terms, and no one would hear different from me. Later that morning, the baby's cry cut across the yard while I was splitting kindling. By the time I reached the door, Nidita had her in her arms, swaying in a low crouch. Her fever hadn't broken, but her eyes had a steadier fire. She spoke softly in her own tongue, words meant only for the child. I eased the door shut and left them to it. I cooked extra cornmeal mush with goat's milk and a pinch of salt. She ate wrapped in a blanket, silent, except for the sound of the baby nursing. After she swept near the stove, hung her damp blanket outside, and washed the spoon she'd used before setting it back in its place. It was the quiet work of someone who intended to be here tomorrow, too. That afternoon, as we shelled beans on the porch, I asked, "How long since you ate?" She squinted against the sun. 3 days. You come far." She nodded. Walked from Dry Gulch, East Ridge. 15 miles, maybe more, in the rain, barefoot and fevered, carrying more than weight, carrying worry no one should face alone. I fetched the tin of salve I used on the goats and set it beside her. She used it without thanks, like it was expected. I didn't mind. Days passed. No talk of her leaving. She was at the fire each morning, tending the baby, helping where she could. I took the chair at night, giving her the cot. Once she set the baby in my old hat while she stepped outside. I laughed under my breath. She heard but didn't comment. On the 4th day, I caught her watching me mend a fence post. "Why'd you keep her?" she asked. I stood slow, my legs stiff. "Didn't feel right leaving her out there," I said. Her jaw tightened. "I left her because I thought she'd have a better chance, not because I didn't want her. A man said he'd kill her if I didn't go." I didn't need a name. I'd met men like that before. "You think he's still coming?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "But if he is, I'll be ready." I went to the barn, brought down a box from the rafters, and set it at her feet. Inside were 2 pistols, my wife's old Derringer, and a Navy Colt from the war. I held out the Derringer. "You shoot?" She shook her head. "I can learn." I nodded. "We'll start tomorrow." That night, the 3 of us sat by the fire, Ruthie batting at a length of wool string tied to a stool leg, Nidita mending a sleeve, me polishing rust from an old branding iron. Coyotes called across the flats. The air smelled clean from the rain. No one spoke about leaving. The quiet between us had shifted. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was the start of something slower, harder, but steady enough to last if we let it. Morning came with a clean sky and cool air, the kind that carried sound clear across the flats. After we ate, I took her behind the barn where the ground dipped toward the field and lined tin cans on the fence rail. I handed her the derringer, keeping my voice steady. Don't grip too tight. Let the barrel do the work, and don't close your eyes when you fire. She nodded without speaking and sighted down the short barrel. The first shot went wide, the tin clattering against the post, but staying upright. She lowered the pistol, studied it a moment, and tried again. By the end of that morning, she'd dropped 1 can out of 4. She reloaded slow, each cartridge placed with care. On the second day, she hit 2. Within a week, she could load without looking, her hands sure and smooth. I didn't praise her much, just gave a nod when she knocked over more cans than she missed. She seemed to prefer it that way. It was about that time I noticed her watching the goats, not idly, but with the same close study she'd shown the pistol. The next morning, she was up before me, already milking them into a tin pail, steam curling from the fresh milk in the cool air. That night, a small jar of goat cheese sat on the table, salted and set just so. She didn't say it was for me, and I didn't ask, but I ate the whole thing. The following morning, there was another jar waiting. Ruthie was gaining strength. She could hold her head up longer, reaching for my shirt buttons or the edge of Nidita's braid when it swung close. She'd smile when her mother sang low by the fire. I kept a watch on the horizon, scanning the ridge when I made my rounds. I'd told Nidita we'd be ready if the man she feared came back, but she hadn't spoken his name again. I let it lie. One afternoon, while mending the barn roof, I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind since that first night. She was sorting nails on the ground below. "That morning you left her here," I said. "Why this place?" She looked up after a pause. "I passed through once last summer before Ruthie. You didn't see me." I stayed up in the arroyo and watched from the ridge. "Why watch this place?" I asked. "You didn't shoot the coyotes when they took from your field. You let them pass." She met my eyes briefly. I thought a man like that wouldn't shoot a child either. By evening, the roof was patched. We had beans and salt pork on the porch. A bit of cornbread she'd made with goat's milk and the last of the dry cornmeal. Ruthie napped in her box nearby. The light faded slow over the flats, and the air carried the first hint of spring. That night, Nidita spoke more about the man. "He wasn't Apache," she said flatly. "White. Said he bought me. Claimed he had papers, kept me near a rail camp outside town. When I got pregnant, he said it wasn't his. Beat me until I bled. Thought she wouldn't make it." Her eyes shifted to Ruthie asleep beside her. "I left one night when he was drunk. I didn't know where to go. I thought maybe if I left her somewhere safe, she could be found. I didn't think I could protect her." "You did," I said quietly. "You came back." She looked at me for a long moment. "I was afraid." "So was I answered. "Didn't know what I was doing. Still don't." A trace of a smile touched her mouth, at that the first I'd seen that wasn't shadowed by worry. Later, I found her folding laundry in the corner, my shirts, linens, blankets, each one scrubbed and hung to dry over the line she'd strung between the posts. She folded the sleeves carefully, as though the work they'd once done mattered to her. The days warmed the wind, shifting from sharp to mild. We planted beans and root vegetables in the field beside the goat pen, working in steady silence. She tied her hair back with a strip of twine, face streaked with dirt and sunlight. By the time we finished the last row, I realized there was still much about her. I didn't know her people, whether she wanted to find them again, or if they were even alive. That evening I asked, "You ever think about going back to your people?" She looked into the fire for a long while. "There's no one to go back to. They were driven out when I was a girl. Some starved, some were taken, some vanished into the land. I was sent to a white family who claimed to be missionaries. They weren't. I ran away at 14. They caught me, tied me to a post for 3 days. Second time I made it to a cattle camp, hid in a wagon, worked in a boarding house 2 winters. Then I met him. She didn't speak the man's name. I don't think like a tribe anymore. I don't belong anywhere." I shook my head. "You belong here if you want to." She didn't answer with words, just rested her hand over mine. The next morning, I saddled the mare for a trip into town. We were low on flour, salt, lamp oil, and ammunition. I also knew a man who never came to town, drew attention, and attention was the last thing we needed. I rode in slow, hat brim, low coat, dusty. Bought what we needed without lingering. When someone asked if I was still living out past Willow Ridge, I gave a single nod and nothing more. I took the back road home, but halfway along the ridge I saw it fresh boot tracks in the soft dirt. Heavy tread, too clean for a local farmer. Maybe one man, maybe more. I kept my pace steady, eyes scanning the trees. When I reached the cabin, Nadita was in back, Ruthie in a sling across her chest, hanging laundry in the mild breeze. I told her what I'd seen. She didn't ask who. Just said, "Then we stay ready." We worked until sundown, reinforcing the barn door, nailing fresh planks over the inside shutters, packing a small satchel for Ruthie just in case. I cleaned the rifle and laid the Derringer within easy reach. She practiced loading it again, fingers moving with practiced ease now. That night, after the work was done and Ruthie slept, Nadita stood by the hearth, quiet but steady. I stepped closer. "If he comes, we don't run," I said. She nodded once. "We fight." Her eyes stayed on mine. "I need you to know something. You and that girl, you're not here because of guilt. You're not a burden I took on." I paused. "I want you here. Both of you." She held my gaze. "I'm not leaving again." I leaned down, kissed her forehead, and pulled her close. Somewhere out in the hills, a man was coming. But now, we were ready. The next 2 days passed with a stillness that never felt settled. Nadita moved through her chores the same way she always had, but her eyes drifted to the horizon more than before. I checked the fence line 3 times a day instead of once. Neither of us said it aloud, but the shift in rhythm told its own story. Whoever had left those boot prints wasn't passing through. They were looking. By late afternoon of the second day, the sky had turned that pale gold that comes before dusk. I saddled the mare, took the Winchester, and rode the ridge north to see if I could trace where the tracks began. The wind carried the dry smell of mesquite and dust. Near the mouth of a shallow gulch, I found the remains of a small fire pit, ash still gray and soft. Around it were more boot marks, the tread pressed deep into the dirt. A strip of canvas from a saddlebag hung torn on a low branch, and in the bark of a dead tree, someone had carved a single name, Lewis. I stayed there a moment, the evening light slanting long across the ground. Then I turned for home, keeping the mare at a steady walk. Nadita was standing in the doorway when I rode in, Ruthie balanced on her hip. She didn't speak until she saw my face. "Lewis," I gave a single nod. "He's close." She took a long breath, but didn't falter. "Will you stay with me if he comes?" I stepped up onto the porch. I've already stayed. That night, we didn't sleep much. The rifle was within reach. The Derringers stayed on the table. Ruthie slept between us on the cot. We didn't speak of running. It wasn't part of the plan anymore. Morning broke without sound, but the wind moving low across the grass. I was up before the light had fully settled, walking the property with the rifle in hand. No fresh sign, no movement along the ridge. Still the quiet felt like the pause before a door opens. Inside, Nidita kept to her work, steady, but watchful. Ruthie was restless, refusing milk and clinging to her mother's shirt. Children know before the rest of us do. After breakfast, I set the Derringer on the table between us. I broke it open, showed her how to load each round from scratch, and had her do it again until she could manage without looking down. If it comes to it, I said, you don't hesitate. Her answer was even. I won't. We spent the afternoon shoring up the barn, wiring the gate shut, moving Ruthie's basket to the farthest corner from the door. Nidita prepared the root cellar, laying in water and blankets, in case the baby had to be hidden. The sun was dipping when we finished. The wind had turned warm and dry, carrying thin sheets of dust across the yard. By the time the light was gone, Ruthie was asleep. Nidita sat by the door with the Derringer in her lap. I moved beside her, laying a hand over hers. He'll come, she said. He always does. I kept my eyes on hers. Then, let him. He won't walk away this time. Her face stayed calm, but the weight in her gaze told me she'd heard every word. I leaned in and kissed her, slow and certain. She returned it, one hand holding me closer, the other still firm on the pistol's grip. That night, we made love for the first time since the talk of his return. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't to forget. It was a choice solid and without doubt. Afterward, she lay against my chest, her arm across my waist, the fire burning low. What happens if he never comes? She asked in the quiet. I thought on it a moment. Then we just live. For the first time in weeks, she smiled, tired but real. Just before dawn, a hard knock struck the door. It came again, slower, heavier. I rose without speaking, the rifle in my hand. Nidita had Ruthie in her arms, holding her close. I unlatched the door and stepped out onto the porch. A tall man stood in the dirt, his clothes coated in trail dust, spurs tapping with each step. His left hand rested on his belt, the right loose at his side. Evening, Calter, he said. Heard you've been keeping something of mine. I stayed still, the rifle steady. Don't see your name on anything here. He smiled, thin and sure. I ain't come to argue. Just here to collect what's mine and ride out quiet. She ain't yours, I said. His face changed, the edge sharpening. She was. Had papers, claimed her fare. She's not property. From the doorway, Nidita stood in the shadows, Ruthie tucked against her chest. The Derringer was hidden under her shawl. The man's eyes found her, and his voice hardened. You come now. Don't make me step inside. I raised the rifle. You're not going anywhere near them. His mouth pulled tight. You willing to die for some squaw and a half-breed? I already decided, I said. His hand twitched toward his hip. My shot cracked sharp in the morning air. He stumbled back, fell to the dirt, blood blooming across his shirt. I stepped off the porch, the rifle never wavering until the last breath left him. When I came back inside, Nidita was rocking Ruthie, her face pale but unshaken. He's gone, I told her. She nodded once. The cabin felt different now. Not lighter, but final. The waiting was over. I buried Lewis just past the fence line, where the ground dipped away from sight of the cabin. The work was done by hand, each shovel of earth turned over in silence. When it was finished, I set a plain stone to mark it, nothing more. I didn't ask Nidita to come out. She stayed inside with Ruthie, rocking her in the chair until the baby's breathing went soft again. When I stepped back into the cabin, my hands still covered in dirt, she looked over from where she sat. The Derringer was on the table beside her. He won't be found by accident, I said. She gave a single nod. We didn't speak of him again that morning. The day passed slow, the kind of quiet that comes when something long expected is finally over. I rode into town near sundown, not for food or powder, but for paper and a stub of pencil. I paid in silver, offered no reason, and left without stopping to talk. When I handed her the folded sheet that evening, she turned it over, like she wasn't sure it was meant for her. "Write down what you want her to know," I told her. "About where you came from. About you." She stared at the paper for a long moment before nodding. "I never thought I'd get to do that," she said. We sat at the table while she worked, her head bent over the page. The words came slow, written first in Apache, then in English beneath. Now and again, she asked how to spell something, my voice giving the letters, while I kept my eyes on the fire. When she was done, she folded the paper, slipped it into a tin box with a beaded necklace she hadn't worn since that first night, and tucked the box under a loose floorboard. "If something happens," she said quietly, "she'll still know." The weeks that followed carried a different weight. The air between us was no longer strung tight with waiting. We still worked mending the porch steps, hauling water, tending the goats, but it was steady work, not braced against a storm. Ruthie began crawling, her small hands reaching for anything close enough to grasp. I carved her a horse from a scrap of pine, smoothing the edges until the wood shone. She clutched it like it was the only thing she'd ever owned. One afternoon, Nadita stepped out of the cabin, holding something in her hand, a silver hairpin shaped like a crescent moon. She turned it over twice before walking toward me where I sat on the porch rail. "I found this in the drawer," she said. I set aside the hammer I'd been using. "I carved it back when you first came. Didn't know what it was for then." She smiled faintly. "I know now." She pulled her hair back and slid the pin into place, the metal catching in the sunlight. I stood wiping the dust from my palms. "You know what that means, don't you?" Her voice was steady. "I do. I love you, Burke." The words came simple, without pause. I cupped her face and said them back. There was no preacher, no vows spoken in front of others. The promise was made all the same. Summer settled in slow. Days baked the land in gold, and the goats lay under the shade trees with their sides heaving. Inside, life carried on without fear. Ruthie had taken to walking her steps, unsteady arms flailing to keep balance. She called me Burr, the only part of my name she could manage, and it undid me each time. We never spoke of Lewis again, not because we forgot, but because his shadow no longer reached the cabin. The sheriff had heard my account, a stranger on my land who didn't leave, and that was the end of it. No one came asking questions. One morning, with the sun just clearing the ridge, I found Nadita sitting on the porch steps, her hands folded over her belly. I sat down beside her. She looked over, her voice low. "I think I'm with child." I met her gaze. "You sure?" She nodded. "I know the feeling, felt it before." We sat quiet for a moment. Then I rested my hand over hers. "All right?" She studied me like she was waiting for more. "You want this?" I nodded. "I want everything that comes with you. That includes this." Her shoulders eased, and she leaned against me, the morning light warming the boards beneath our feet. From then on, I took on more of the heavier work, hauling wood, lifting feed sacks, while she moved a little slower, but still kept to her cooking and the garden. By the time the first beans were ready to pick, the rhythm of our days felt set. The land was the same, but what we had on it was different. The heat that summer pressed on everything from the parched ground to the boards of the porch that warmed underfoot by mid-morning. The goats stayed in the shade most of the day, and we worked slower, saving the heavier chores for early or late. Ruthie, steady on her feet now, followed Nadita from the garden to the wash line, clutching the wooden horse I'd carved for her. One evening, after the sun slipped behind the ridge and the air turned bearable, I brought out the old iron brand that had hung in the barn for years. I'd cleaned it that afternoon, the crescent and horseshoe marks sharp again. "Thought we'd put this to use," I said. She stood beside me while I heated the iron in the coals, the orange glow reflecting in her eyes. The first goat jerked at the smell of hot metal, but she held it steady while I pressed the brand to its flank. The hiss faded quick, leaving the mark that said plainly, "This land, these animals belong to us." Later on the porch, we sat in the same place she had, that first night Ruthie between us, with a strip of cornbread in her hand. Her fingers curled into mine, and I felt her other hand rest lightly on her belly. She was showing just enough now that there was no mistaking the life growing there. "You never asked me to marry you," she said, her voice even. I looked over. Didn't think I needed to. She gave a small smile. "You don't. But I'd still say yes." I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a thin leather cord with a carved wooden ring strung through the center. I'd made it not long after Lewis died, but hadn't known the right time to give it. "Will you wear this?" She turned it in her palm before nodding. "I will." She slid it over her head, the ring settling against her collarbone. That was all there was to it. No church, no paper, just the promise and the way we'd stood together when it counted. The next morning, Ruthie came out onto the porch, holding a half-eaten apple, and dropped down between us, bumping her head gently against my leg. Nidita reached over to smooth her hair, her other hand still resting on her belly. I looked out over the fields, the fence line, the garden she'd coaxed into green in soil that had once been nothing but dust. It was the same land I'd worked for years, but it didn't feel the same. A week later, I rode into town for flour, salt, and nails. The talk at the mercantile was of a new shipment for the rail spur and the usual squabble over grazing rights, nothing that concerned me. Still, I kept my ears open and my words few. On the ride back, clouds were building low in the west, promising rain. The wind had that charged feel to it, stirring the grass and carrying the scent of wet earth before the first drop fell. I reached the cabin just as the rain started the boards on the porch creaking under my boots. Inside, Ruthie was stacking blocks by the hearth, and Nidita was at the table mending a shirt. She glanced up with a quick smile before going back to her stitches. It struck me then how much had changed without us marking the days. The waiting for trouble was gone. What filled its place was quieter, steadier. That night, as the rain pattered on the roof, she laid the mended shirt across my lap. "You wear this more than any other," she said. I brushed my hand over the cloth. "Fits better than the rest." She didn't answer, but her eyes held mine for a long moment before she stood and checked on Ruthie now, asleep in her blanket. The rain stayed through the next day, softening the ground and leaving puddles along the fence line. By afternoon, the sun had returned, turning the wet earth to the smell of clay and grass. We walked the property together, checking for washouts and making note of where the fence needed tightening. Ruthie trailed behind, stopping to pick up every smooth stone she saw. When we reached the far edge of the pasture, I paused to look out toward the ridge. It was clear now, no movement, no dust trails. But as we turned back toward the house, the thought came unbidden. Clear ground can change fast. And though Lewis was gone, I knew there were always others in this country who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. We reached the porch as the light was fading, the boards still damp under our boots. Inside, the fire was already laid, the scent of coffee mixing with the last of the cool air drifting in. I poured 2 cups, set one in front of her, and sat across the table. We didn't speak much, the quiet between us. Easy now, but in the back of my mind, I could feel it. The sense that some new turn lay ahead, just beyond sight. By late summer, the grass along the fence line had browned the wind, carrying the dry rustle of seed heads. The days were steady chores split without fuss, but the air held that edge I'd learned not to ignore. It was a Tuesday when I noticed a dust trail out past the ridge. It was faint, the kind that might fade if the wind shifted, but it didn't. By noon, it had thickened, the heat shimmering above it. I set my tools aside and stepped onto the porch, shading my eyes. Two riders moving slow but steady, making no attempt to hide their approach. Nidita was inside with Ruthie, the sound of her voice low as she sang to the child. I told her we might have company before supper and went to check the rifle. It hung over the door, oiled and ready the way it always was. They reached the yard just as the sun started to drop. Both men wore dust-caked coats and had the look of men who'd been riding far. The older one tipped his hat, deep creases around his eyes. "Name's Caleb North," he said, voice rough but steady. "This here's my boy Eli." The younger, no more than 19, gave a short nod. Caleb glanced toward the cabin. "We're looking for a woman and a child," he said, words measured. "Apache woman, little girl with her. Folks in town said she might have passed this way." I didn't move from the porch. Plenty of folks passed through. "Why are you looking?" His jaw tightened. "Because they were taken from my brother's place 2 winters back." The wind shifted, bringing the smell of sun-baked earth. I could feel Nidita's eyes on me from the doorway. I kept mine on Caleb. "Don't know anything about that," I said. "And even if I did, anyone on my land is under my protection." Eli shifted in his saddle, glancing at his father. Caleb studied me for a moment, then let the reins slacken. "If you see him, tell him we ain't here to harm him. My brother's gone now. I just want to set things right." I gave no answer, and after a long moment, they turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come, the dust swallowing them again. Inside, Nidita stood by the table, Ruthie in her arms. She said nothing, but her grip on the child was tight. I closed the door and slid the latch. "You know them?" I asked. She shook her head, but her gaze stayed fixed on the window. That night, neither of us slept much. The lantern burned low on the table, the shadows shifting with each gust of wind. Ruthie stirred once, then settled again, her small hand curled against Nidita's chest. Come morning, I saddled the bay and rode the fence line, making sure every gate was shut and the low spots in the creek bed were watched. Nothing moved out past the ridge, but I kept looking back, half expecting a dust trail to rise again. 2 days passed without sight of them, but the air hadn't eased. It was just before sundown on the 3rd day, when I heard hoofbeats again, this time faster, closer. I stepped out, rifle in hand. A single rider emerged from the trail. It was Caleb. He dismounted, slow hands open. "Didn't mean to cause worry," he said, "but I need you to hear something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, the edges creased and worn. I didn't take it right away. "What's that?" He held it out. "Statement from the circuit judge in Dry Creek. Says the woman and child were freed under the law last spring. No claim on them now." I took the paper, reading the lines by the porch light. The ink was faded in spots, but the seal was clear. When I looked up, Caleb's face was set, but there was no malice there. "Tell her," he said. "If she's who I think she is, she's kin through marriage. I don't aim to take her just to make sure she knows she's free to go where she pleases." I said I'd pass the message. He mounted up and rode off, his shape soon swallowed by the dimming light. Inside, I handed the paper to Nidita. She read it slow, her lips pressing together. Then she set it down and looked at me. "It doesn't change where I belong," she said. I nodded, but in the quiet that followed, I knew this wasn't finished. Out here, news like that had a way of stirring old debts and new trouble. The days after Caleb's visit passed without another rider on the horizon. The air cooled a little, the evening wind carrying the scent of sage and the far-off sound of cattle moving in the open range. Life settled back into its rhythm, but there was a new steadiness in Nidita's eyes. One Sunday, we rode into town together for the first time since she'd come here. Ruthie sat between us on the wagon seat, her small hands gripping the edge, eyes wide, at the sight of buildings and people. Folks turned to look, but no one spoke against us. The paper Caleb had left, now tucked in Nadita's satchel, seemed to carry an unspoken weight. We stopped by the Mercantile, then the Post. The circuit judge himself, a broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples, stepped out to greet us. He tipped his hat to Nadita and spoke with the respect owed to any free woman. She met his gaze without flinching, and in that moment I knew the shadows of the past no longer held her in place. On the way home, the sun dropped low, turning the sky a deep gold. Ruthie dozed against Nadita's arm, the wheels humming over the dirt road. We didn't speak much, but there was no need. Out here, silence can say more than words. That night, after Ruthie was asleep, Nadita stood by the doorway, looking out across the dark fields. "You gave me more than a place to hide," she said softly. "You gave us a life." I didn't answer right away, just stepped beside her and looked out into the night. The land stretched wide, the stars scattered bright overhead. A man can't change the past, but he can guard what's in front of him. In the months that followed, the talk in town shifted. Folks came to know Nadita not as a stranger, but as the woman who made the best bread at the church social, whose little girl could already ride a pony bareback. And Caleb, true to his word, never came back except once to bring a sack of seed and a quiet nod of respect. By the first frost, the cabin felt less like mine alone and more like ours. The creak of the floorboards, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of Ruthie's laughter outside, all of it rooted here as sure as the oak by the well. Looking back now, I reckon justice isn't always about the law or the papers stamped with seals. Sometimes it's simply the right to live in peace, to choose where you belong, and to have that choice respected. Out here, that can mean everything. If you've listened this far, maybe you know a story of your own, about finding your place, or about standing guard when someone else needed it. Those stories matter. I hope you'll hold them close and maybe share them with someone who needs to hear.